And then I actually went in and looked to see what the Great Plains, of which you're considered to be part of, what the climate models are saying about here. And then this is primarily in terms of temperature rise based on both the higher emission scenario, worst case, or the lower emission scenario, which is, I guess, what people are hoping for, because that's the best case scenario. And what you see is by 2090 and by 2050, an increase in terms of average temperature much greater than what we have and have had historically. So I'm not trying to, say the sky is falling, but very reputable people out there are suggesting that there are going to be some significant changes. And of course, which apparently you are not interested in terms of hurricanes yet, and sea level rise, but I assure you there are large portions of this country that are very concerned about sea level rise. And areas like Florida, for example, that have some serious considerations. Now, okay, up to this point in time, you say he's absolutely out of his mind. He's an alarmist. The sky is falling. I don't care. I'm not going to be alive in 2090. I've got my free pizza. I don't care. I've got to suffer through another 10 minutes or so. Okay, well, your government to the rescue. Okay, there are federal and state rules now being promulgated that will force us to think about climate change. President Obama last fall issued Executive Order 13514, which said that all federal agencies must, as part of their strategic sustainability performance plan, look at climate change risks. And what are they going to do? What are they responsible for which there's vulnerabilities? And so you can say, well, that's the federal government. That's Washington, D.C. We're out here in the middle of nowhere, plains, whatever it is. We don't have to worry about Washington, D.C. Okay, well, federal government to the rescue. Okay? There's something called the Council of Environmental Quality, which is the group that provides guidelines for what's called NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, i.e. environmental impact statements. 2 weeks ago, the Council of Environmental Quality issued proposed guidelines that in essence said, from now on, they haven't been approved yet, but from now on, when you do an environmental analysis on any project for which there's federal money or for which there's a significant impact, you must look at the relationship between that project and climate change and incorporate that consideration into the alternatives that you're looking at and to develop mitigation strategies for whatever it is that you say is going to happen. Okay? If this goes into NEPA, which I suspect it will, this will fundamentally make all of you who ever do anything in transportation in terms of project development type activities for which there's environmental impacts, you will now be doing climate adaptation studies as part of the project analysis process. This is what's being proposed. They should determine which climate change impacts warrant consideration. Through the scoping process, which is the initial discussions of what's important, you should determine whether climate change is important, what's the sensitivity, location, time frame of proposed action as it relates to predicted changes in climate, what effects are going to have. These are all right from the current NEPA regs, but adding climate change adaptation as part of the requirements. Observed and proposed effects of climate change will warrant construction or consideration. How does this potentially affect the integrity, the vulnerability? Does it magnify the damage strength? In other words, these rules, proposed rules, which I believe will be passed and promulgated, will in essence revolutionize how we currently do NEPA level analysis in this country, not only in transportation, but any project which has federal money or a federal action such as a permitting requirement that is going to be undertaken. So this suggests to me that in fact we need to think about how we do these things. I mean, how do we look at these types of things? Well, if you don't like the federal government, you can say, well, whatever. There are now states out there that have actually passed their own state laws that require studies and analyses that do with climate change. California is always California, always out front. Schwarzenegger signed this in 2008, said that all state agencies must now plan for sea level rise and other forms of climate change. Washington State required there to be a climate action group and work with the University of Washington to figure out what's going on. Massachusetts, all state agencies must look at strategies to combat changes in climate and in particular rising sea levels. And these are only 3 states. I had many, many more. I didn't put them on here. So there are states now that are also requiring planners and engineers and public policy people to take a look at what this all means. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers last year is now required to incorporate sea level rise projections into all of their projects, which of course they handle docks, the dikes and the locks and the Mississippi, Tennessee, etc. So that would be obvious, but they're now required to do it. And there's actually this wonderful flow chart where they show how they do it, which I'm not going to show you. But the point is that in essence, federal, state, and other agencies are now thinking about and in fact beginning to require us professionals to take a look at adaptation. Well, what do the studies say? There have been some studies done, hypothetical studies. In Seattle, a study was done in 2005 that said, hey, there are a lot of different possible changes. Bridge and culverts could be affected, coastal roads could be affected, how we do pavement surfaces could be affected, drainage clearly, slope stability could be affected. That was Seattle. Boston and New York City, not surprisingly, were worried about increased flooding into their transit tunnels, which tend to be underground. Water comes up, water goes down, suddenly your subway system is flooded. The Gulf Coast study of all the Gulf Coast states was done in 2006. There's now a Gulf Coast 2 study, which I'm involved with, which says what are we looking at in terms of the Gulf states because they have sea level rise issues and other things particularly vulnerable. This study says that by 2100, the temperatures that are likely to occur in the Gulf Coast will be reaching our design standards with regard to our pavement. There's no contingency anymore if we just keep doing what we're doing. The impact will not be everywhere, it'll be in certain areas, and if you have property in Louisiana, I would suggest you move to Tennessee or something. Red means if you have a 4-foot sea level rise, which is the expected sea level rise between now and 2100, you've got problems. Okay, well, let me just go to maintenance is a big issue with regard to how we maintain our systems with, in Massachusetts, I was responsible for a lot of stuff, but one of them was cutting grass. And in England, what they've seen is that more rain, more grass, more cutting. What does that mean? So something as simple as that is an issue for many transportation agencies. I want to talk about permafrost. Okay. All right. So what are the critical components of infrastructure design that could possibly be affected? What I did as part of this TRB study is I said, well, there are actually several things that we can think about looking at what we call a typical section. This is a typical section on a road, which leads to things like, well, what about subsurface conditions? What about how we specify materials? How we look at cross-section and standard design dimensions? What do we do with drainage erosion? How do we deal with structures? And in fact, where do we put the facility to begin with? Do we put a facility in a coastal 100-year floodplain, which is probably going to be underwater 50 years from now? One may suggest you don't want to do that. And so location engineering also is a real big issue. New Zealand, I love the New Zealanders. They're way ahead of us. Just several years ago, they said, we are vulnerable. More rain, more slides, hill slides, higher winds. What are we going to do in New Zealand? They said, what are our vulnerable assets? They went out and looked at all sorts of things, bridges, culverts, causeways, paved surfaces, surface drainage, etc. And they came to the conclusion that, in fact, how they are currently using design standards may, in fact, not be appropriate to protect the bridges and culverts that have a design life of 50 years or more, which often is a design life that we're looking at for some of our facilities. And so they said, we need to do some form of an analysis to take a look at the unique circumstances in this particular situation, and perhaps should we change the design standards? Should we change how we do design in anticipation of a higher risk of changes in the local climate and the weather that will affect our particular facilities? I think that's an important issue.